So we are going to look at the faithfulness of God in the Old Testament. So when you look at the Old Testament, so in the Old Testament, this attribute is ascribed to God in passages where the Hebrew words denoting faithfulness do not occur. So it is implied in the covenant name Yahweh as unfolded in Exodus 3:13-15, which not only expresses God's self-existence and unchangeableness, but, as the context indicates, puts God's immutability in special relation to his gracious promises, thus denoting God's unchangeable faithfulness, which is emphasized in the Old Testament to awaken trust in God. Which is so that is faithfulness in the Old Testament. We will not find it in for those, like we've said, that for those scriptures or those passages which talk about the faithfulness of God in the Old Testament, you will not find the word faithfulness there itself, but in context they are trying to indicate God's immutability or unchangeableness in relation with his promises or in relation to his promises, so that, and denoting that unchangeable faithfulness of God, which is greatly emphasized in the Old Testament with an aim of awakening faith or trust in God in those people of the Old Testament of that covenant. So about that, you can read Deuteronomy 7:9, Psalms 36:5, Isaiah 11:5, Hosea 12:6, Hosea 12:9. Yeah, so it is moreover God's faithfulness as well as his immutability which is implied in those passages where God is called a rock as being the secure object of religious trust. So we are seeing the different passages in the Old Testament that show God's faithfulness. We've seen first those scriptures where you don't find the word, those passages where you don't find the word faithfulness, but in context they imply his faithfulness, and have said those scriptures. And then there are also those passages where God is referred to as a rock, so as a rock and as being the secure object of our religious trust. So those passages also are intended to show God's faithfulness and his immutability. So among such passages we have Deuteronomy 32:4, Deuteronomy 30:15, Psalms 18:2, Psalms 42:9, and Isaiah 17:10. I'll be reading one verse or one scripture for every portion of scriptures I give out. So Psalms 42, Psalms 42:9, it says, I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why do I go mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? So in those passages where they use the word rock when referring to God, it is one way of indicating his faithfulness as well as his immutability, setting him forth as a secure object of our religious trust due to the fact that he is unchangeable or is faithful. Because we know that always we would like to trust, or we always trust those people that seem to be faithful or that prove to be faithful, because they will never let you down. You hope that they will never let you down. So that's why God is a secure object of religious trust, because of his nature, being that he is faithful in nature and unchangeable. But then this same attribute is also implied where God reveals himself to Moses and to Israel as the God of Abraham, God of Isaac and Jacob. So when God talks of himself as the God of Isaac and Jacob, and Abraham when he is talking to Moses, is also, those passages also bring out that attribute. So we have such passages like Exodus 36, Exodus 3:15, Exodus 3:16. So I'm going to read Exodus 3:16 and 15. So Exodus 3:15 says, God also said to Moses, "Say this to the people of Israel: The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations." 16. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, The Lord, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt. So such scriptures or such passages. So the truth concerning God here taught is not simply that he stood in a gracious relation to the patriarchs, but that he is faithful to his gracious promises to their fathers, and that what he was to them, he will continue to be to Moses and Israel. So that is the fundamental idea in the Old Testament concerning the faithfulness of God. So those are some of the passages that show God's faithfulness in the Old Testament, as we've seen and classified them as in those that don't have the word faithfulness, but in context they are talking about his faithfulness. Those where God is referred to as a rock, implying his immutability or unchangeableness and faithfulness, and those passages where he addresses himself as the father of their as the God of their fathers. So God's faithfulness is closely related to his righteousness in the Old Testament. So in the second half of the prophets of Isaiah and many of the Psalms, righteousness is ascribed to God because he comes to help and save his people. Thus, righteousness as a quality, along with or parallel with grace, mercy, and faithfulness, is ascribed to God in we can see in Isaiah 41:10, Isaiah 42:6, Isaiah 45:13, Isaiah 45:19, Isaiah 45:21, Isaiah 63:1. So we're going to read Isaiah 41:10 and see what it says. So it says, Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. So you see that always God came to help his people. So God's righteousness in the Old Testament is related to him coming and saving his people. So it appears in these places to widen out from its exclusive judicial association and to become a quality of God as Savior of his people. So according to this attribute of God, it is appealed to in the Psalms as the basis of hope for salvation and deliverance, like in Psalms 31:1, Psalms 35:24, Psalms 71:2, Psalms 143:11. So I'm going to read one of them. So Psalms 143:11 says, For your name's sake, O Lord, preserve my life. In your righteousness, bring my soul out of trouble. For your name's sake, O Lord, preserve my life. In your righteousness, bring my soul out of trouble. So you see that this attribute of God, his faithfulness, is the basis, or is what is appealed to God in those Psalms as the basis of hope for the salvation or deliverance of his people. So hence, this attribute is associated with God's mercy and grace. That his faithfulness is associated with his mercy and grace. That is Psalms 36, verse 5, 36 verse 9, Psalms 89:14. Let's read one of them and see what it says. So we are going to read Psalms 89:14, which says, Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Steadfast love and faithfulness go before you. So the righteousness of God is associated with his mercy and grace, also with his faithfulness, like in those scriptures we've seen. And then there is Zechariah 8:8. In addition to those, and Psalms 88:11, Psalms 88:12, Psalms 89:14, like we've seen, Psalms 119, Psalms 119 verse 137, Psalms 119 verse 142, Psalms 143 verse 1, regarding to that. So what concerns us, however, in regard to this close relationship between righteousness and faithfulness, is to observe that this should not be pressed to the extent of identification of righteousness with the covenant faithfulness in these passages in the Psalms and the second half of Isaiah. So we are not to identify them together. Righteousness and faithfulness are not identified together. The simple illustration I thought of is that illustration that you cannot identify. Okay, let's say I may say that I don't want to be identified with those people, as in I don't want to be known of them, or to be part of them, to be identified with them, as in when I'm close, when I'm being part of them. So you can, righteousness is not identified. They may not be in the same group with faithfulness, though they are closely related. So the idea seems to be that Israel has sinned and has no claim upon Yahweh, because we are looking at his faithfulness according to the Old Testament. So we are looking at the relationship, or the closeness between, the close relation between God's righteousness and his faithfulness. So it's what we are looking at. So the idea seems to be that Israel has sinned and has no claim upon Yahweh, so finding her only hope for deliverance in his mercy and faithfulness. But this very fact that Yahweh is merciful and faithful becomes, as it were, the claim, or Israel's claim, or rather the ground of Israel's hope of deliverance from her enemies. Hence, in the recognition of this claim of his people, God is said to be righteous in manifesting his mercy and faithfulness, so that his righteousness, no less than his mercy and faithfulness, becomes the ground of his people's hope. So when you look at the people of the Old Testament, or the Israelites in their journey, they were unfaithful to God, in contrary to the covenant that he had made with them when he was bringing them out of the land of Egypt. So since they were unfaithful, an illustration I can give is an agreement between two parties or people. So when people make an agreement, that agreement has conditions. So in case one party goes against the agreement, or maybe breaks the agreement, so this other person or this other party has I don't know how to call it, has either the authority to make the other ones pay according to what, or to be penalized according to the conditions of the agreement. So if they make them to pay or to be penalized, they are fair. And if they don't make them to pay, then it will be because of their mercy, but other people have no claim on this party, because they have wronged the agreement. So it is the same thing that when Israel was unfaithful to God, they lost the claim of God's salvation or God's deliverance from their enemies, and then the only claim they remained with was upon God, and as in it was upon him, or it was upon, okay, it was him to have mercy on them. So the only claim they had was the mercy of God, and his faithfulness were the only grounds of their hope of deliverance from their enemies by the Lord. So they didn't have claim because they had already wronged the agreement, or they were unfaithful. So when God comes up and he shows them mercy, and he shows them his righteousness, his faithfulness, So that fact that God recognized his people and he showed them his mercy and faithfulness, so it was an act, a righteous act. It was like because there is doing right and then doing wrong. So there are acts of righteousness, or maybe if we can say things that are right, we can say that they are acts of righteousness, or they are something like that. So it was righteous. So God is said to be righteous in manifesting his mercy and faithfulness. Like someone can be said to be righteous by, because maybe marrying is an act of righteousness because it is godly, or it is commanded by God. So it is a right thing to be done. It is an act of righteousness. So if someone that makes a wedding, it is an act of righteousness. So that person can be said to have done something righteous, or to be righteous in that way. So God is said to be righteous in manifesting his mercy and faithfulness, so that his righteousness, no less than his mercy and faithfulness, becomes the ground of his people's hope, because that's the only claim they had remained with for God's deliverance from their enemies. Thus, righteousness is closely related in these cases to faithfulness, but it is not identified with it, nor has it in all cases lost entirely its forensic tone. So this seems to be generally the meaning of righteousness in the Psalms and the second half of Isaiah, with which we may also be compared with Micah 6:9 and Zechariah 8:8. What we've seen above is the meaning of righteousness. They are trying to show the relationship between righteousness and faithfulness of God in the Old Testament. Now let's read Micah and see what it says. So Zechariah 8:8 says, "And I will bring them to dwell in the midst of Jerusalem, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God, in faithfulness and righteousness." So the emphasis which this attribute of God has in the Old Testament is determined by the fact that throughout the whole of the Old Testament, the covenant relation of Yahweh to his people is founded solely in God's grace and not on any merit of theirs, because they had wronged the arguments. So if this covenant relation had been based on any claim of Israel, faithfulness on God's part might have been taken for granted. If at all the Israelites were faithful to God, then his faithfulness would have been taken for granted, because it is always expected that according to the faithfulness of man will be faithful if you're faithful, and if you become unfaithful, he will become unfaithful. So if the other people were faithful, God's unfaithfulness would have been taken for granted. But now it is not taken for granted, because they were not faithful, but for him he remained faithful, which is contrary to us men. When someone becomes unfaithful, we also don't want to remain faithful. So that's what I'm trying to show. So since Yahweh's covenant relation with Israel and his promises of salvation spring solely from and depend wholly upon the grace of God, that which gave firm assurance that the past experience of God's grace would continue in the future was this immutability, was this immutable faithfulness of Yahweh. So it is the faithfulness of God, the unchangeable faithfulness of God, that gave those people assurance that the grace that the Lord showed to them was still to continue even for the future time. It was because of that faithfulness, because for them they had not been faithful, so they remained to depend on the grace of God. on the faithfulness of God. So it is okay, by the faith, that by the unchangeable faithfulness of God, the experience of the fathers of Israel, those people who lived, was given a religious value for Israel from generation to generation. So God still remained with them from generation to generation because of his faithfulness, even when they were unfaithful. And even as the faithfulness of God bridged over the past and the present, so also it continued the connecting link between the present and the future. His faithfulness was always there, it was constant, never changing. He always remained faithful, thus becoming the firm basis of Israel's hope. That constant faithfulness of God thus became the firm basis of Israel's hope. So you can compare it with Psalms 89, which sets forth the faithfulness of God in its greatness, its firmness as the basis of the covenant, and the ground it affords of hope for the future hope from Yahweh, and for the hope that his covenant shall endure forever. So when God's people departed from him, all the more emphasis was put upon his faithfulness, so that the only hope of his lost people lay not only in his grace and mercy, but also in his faithfulness, which stands in marked contrast with the faithfulness and inconsistency of people. So that's what Israel remained to depend, because they had gotten lost. They were lost. So they had departed away from the ways of God. So what they had remained to, whether it was the faithfulness of God that assured them of his deliverance, of his future deliverance. It is so, in simple terms, if you take an illustration that someone can be merciful, and someone can be merciful to someone but still hesitate to help them because of certain reason. But when they have had pity on them, let's say, when they have, I don't know how to put it, but when they have had mercy on them, but okay, so God's faithfulness, grace and mercy were not the only things by which God stood by those people, but also his faithfulness, his faithfulness in connection to his covenant promises, because he was loyal to his promises he made to their fathers. So it was not only his mercy and grace that made him to help Israel in all their, or to protect them from all their enemies, but also his faithfulness to his covenant promises he made to their fathers. So all of those were the reasons, or are the things that made God to help them or to be with them even when they were unfaithful. His grace and mercy along with his faithfulness. So that's what the Old Testament talks about, the faithfulness of God.